I'm sorry. I meant, what I'm thinking is makes the bed 5 days out of 7. Anybody have a rubric like that? But the team wouldn't let you. Marv. I'm kidding you.
Would that be considered another layer?
It could be another layer, or it could be our primary layer. You could say, in fact, we could put it on to say, never makes the bed. Be careful, though. We have to be careful in our rubrics, and we were very cautious in designing. And we may not have this right, but we were very cautious to say always and never. Your best teachers will not be able to achieve always. You can come in on October the 2nd, and that's the day Johnny came. And nobody should ever have Johnny's. Just happens to be the day he came, and things were not exactly right. And so can't say always. And on the never, the teacher can say, and we're thinking, no, that's a really rotten teacher. Really bad performance. But if it's never, Ann can come back to me and say, yes, but you forgot on October the 2nd, I did turn in that lesson plan. So we're very cautious about that, but we could indeed have that. And we could have gradations, and it could very well be another layer. Meeting proficient could very well be 5 days out of 7. It's not perfection. It's proficient is a quality level of performance that makes a positive contribution to children's lives, but it is not perfection. In fact, I don't think exemplary is perfection. I think every single teacher that we have in Louisiana can continue to improve until the last day they teach. But we could say exemplary in our model does it every day. But then we get into some interesting things that we're going to look at a bit later, and that is, if we have these layers, what happens if I make the bed every day, but I make it poorly every day? And I don't tuck in the corners except once or twice a week. So now we have this sort of mix on the rubric, and we have to make some sense on that. And you're going to find that's the case when we start unpacking the rubric that we have.
And when you have to assume, if you're putting that variable in there, though, that you're going to be in that classroom every day to see, if you say 5 days a week or 3 days a week, then you're going to have to observe that bed 3 days a week.
You would, or you have to have a large enough sample that you can infer from the sample. And that's a very interesting point. Is it, Annette? It's a very interesting point because our principals, as evaluators, will generally not be in the classroom as frequently as they need to be. They cannot be. The new design does not mandate enough observation. It mandates based on a reasonableness standard. It has to be feasible to implement. Principals cannot be in there every day, and even if it's a 30-second walkthrough, that's not good enough. You don't see everything you need to see in 30 seconds. And I'm getting into data sources, so let me not go too far down that road. But what it does mandate for us is that you have a sufficient sample, enough frequency that you can sensibly make a judgment about what you're saying. And we've tended to be flawed. On the other side, though, more observation isn't necessarily the solution. I mean, you can observe all day long, every day, and still not see some of these 11 performance standards. They're not all amenable to observation. You can't pick them up by sitting in my classroom. So observation only isn't enough. It's a very good point, though. All right, any other thoughts or questions or comments before we move in? And I'd like to sort of summarize with a few slides for us. But other thoughts on your mind about what a rubric is and how to use a rubric? Let me give you my perspective on rubrics before I go to the slide. And that is, all rubrics are bad. Some of them just happen to be helpful. There are no perfect rubrics. This is the most difficult part of this entire evaluation system to design. It is extremely difficult, and it's going to be challenging to implement it with fidelity. We're going to have to work on it over and over again and get it as close to right as we can. So no rubric is perfect. It's just that some happen to be helpful, and this kind of rubric is helpful. If we don't use a rubrics-based approach in our evaluation, we leave it up to the imagination of the evaluator on how to rate me. You can have 11 beautiful standards. You can have everything else in place. And then I look at you and say, I don't think that's very good. Or I look at you and say, and somebody else looks at you and says, you know, that's pretty good. It's sort of like art. Now, there's certainly art, but what we're doing is adding the science to the evaluation process. It cannot be so artistic that you and I stand in front of the Mona Lisa and one will say, what a magnificent work of art, and the other person says, I don't really care for that. That's not what we can afford to do. Teachers don't trust evaluation for this very reason. They know that if they get an easy evaluator, they get good scores. If they get a hard-nosed evaluator, they get bad scores or lower scores. We must be honest and accurate, and we have to base our results in rating on evidence. We're talking about using data. And we're going to get into that in a lot more detail later. But this rubric is data-driven. It's basing judgment not on my opinion. It's trying to drive out as much subjectivity as possible and replace it with as much objectivity as we can so that it is fair to teachers and is defensible for the evaluators. That's what we're after. Is that making sense to you? What other profession can you imagine that would not be using evidence, data, to drive decision making? And yet you and I have always used osmosis. I walk through the class a couple of times and I'll pick up enough molecules and I can tell you if you're good or not. That's sort of the way we've done business. That is highly unreliable. That gut instinct is something you can't trust. We need evidence. Show me the evidence. And that's what this rubric is predicated on. Okay. Let me go to the very next page in your workbook on the PowerPoint, and let me walk us through. How much time do I have? Am I out of time? 20 minutes. We will be using a 5-point rating scale. And let me again say, there's no perfect rating scale. We've had a great deal of discussion on 4 versus 5, and it's the same, or 3. There's the same discussion in every other state. If Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, applies for relief from adequate yearly progress under NCLB, federal guidelines require that there be at least a 3-point scale. Doesn't mandate a 4 or a 5-point scale. You must have at least a 3-point scale under the U.S. Department of Education guidelines. I had this discussion in another state a couple of days ago about how many we should have. And it varies. It is not perfect. It is our best effort to make as much sense of performance in a differentiated system as we can make. One state that I work with started with, I think they had 4 points on their scale, if I'm remembering, but they had a plus and minus on every one. They had a 12-point scale. And the first thing I tried to do was dissuade them from having that 12-point scale. And this is one time somebody listened to me. You can't make that kind of fine distinction. We're going to do the very best we can with the 5 points. And there's a critical element to think about. And that is the starting point in this rubric is not exemplary, boys and girls. Let me see if I can find this arrow. I don't know where it is. Oh, there it is. I still can't get to it. Here we go. I'm trying to draw here, but I can't draw if I can't see the Etch-a-Sketch. Proficient is the starting point. The mistake we've made is assuming whatever the top level is the starting point. So teachers come into the evaluation setting, and the fact is, we're talking teachers today, but if we were talking principal evaluation, the same thing would happen. The teacher comes into the evaluation expecting to be rated top on everything. Teachers are high achievers. They all want to get A's. They want A+ on everything. What we have to deliver in this message is that proficient is high quality work. It is the expected level of work. And only when there is evidence to support deviating from proficient would one be rated something other than proficient. You go into the evaluation setting with the mindset of proficient, and then when the evidence guides you, you move up or down the scale. Do not go in